Hello and welcome to The Extra Mile. I'm Linda Boudreaux. Our guest today is Gary Lipham. Gary is an antique Louisiana decoy collector. We're talking about duck decoys here. We'll be talking about the decoys themselves and about an upcoming antique decoy show which will be held in Baton Rouge in August. So Gary, welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Linda.
And thank you for bringing these wonderful, wonderful duck decoys. So this is a new area for me, so I'm going to ask the most elementary questions, but what exactly is the whole idea behind duck decoys?
Okay, well, duck decoys are basically developed as a tool. We've seen duck decoys in Louisiana, examples from the late 1800s up till people who presently still carve and hunt over wooden duck decoys today. And the decoys are a North American tradition. They developed in North America, in Canada, the United States, and other countries have, taken the duck decoy and utilized them. But it's a unique folk art that really generated and originated in America.
So that's something else to be proud of.
Oh yeah, we have something that we did first.
And that we do very well and beautifully.
Oh, the best. And Louisiana in particular.
Really, why Louisiana, you think?
Louisiana has a mystique. It's a melting pot of so many different cultures. And as you know, we've got the French, the German, the Slavic. We've opened to any and all people, and different groups over the years and decades have actually carved decoys. And so there's a lot of decoys of different groups, ethnic groups. In fact, today, most of the decoys represented here are of Creole make. And there's other makers. The Cajuns down in Bayou Lafourche made decoys. I've got one example of a Bayou Lafourche decoy here today. But other areas, New Orleans, there were Slavic decoy production of the Vidakoviches and, the people that would all over the state in different times. And the unique thing about Louisiana decoys is that they're a vanishing commodity due to the hurricanes and even in modern times. That's one of the things about antique decoys is that they have a lot of things that can get you. In Hurricane Katrina, a lot of homes were destroyed, and in a lot of homes, any antique decoy was also destroyed.
So the decoys, although they're designed to be in water, didn't survive the hurricane?
Well, a friend of mine over in below New Orleans had 20 feet of water go through his house. All of his decoys were washed out the top of his shop and distributed all over the lower Gulf South. When
I can just see it.
When the National Guard came in, he said, "Any decoy you find is mine." And of course, all these National Guard members brought him decoys of all shapes, sizes. They piled up decoys in his yard after that and they were plastic, different things.
Right.
A few of his got returned, but a lot of them got washed away. Another guy down in Port Sulphur, his whole home and everything was washed away, and then he went around picking up his decoys for several weeks after that along the shore, see what washed back in.
Whatever you could get back.
So those have happened. In fact, during the upcoming show in Baton Rouge that you mentioned, which will be on August 17th at the Bluebonnet Nature Center, we're going to be honoring the Creole carvers. And
why the Creole carvers?
Well, they're a very important group. They were very noteworthy in Louisiana decoy history. There were several references. Of course, Mr. Charles Frank wrote a couple of books, and he was very close to the Creoles. Another reference, Brian Sheremy's book, Lures and Legends, also outlines a lot of Creole decoys. And so the history of the Creole makers is very important, and their decoys are very, very sought after collectively, the ones that remain that haven't been caught up in the storms and floods.
Yeah.
But it's because of their workmanship. The Creoles were very special. They were the artisans of New Orleans. They ended up They did the beautiful cornice work, and they did so much. They did a lot of the plaster work, and so a lot of the beautiful brickwork and a lot of the workmanship in New Orleans was also the same craftsmen that crafted decoys. They would craft birds to hunt with, and then a trio of carvers ended up basically started a cottage industry. There was a gentleman named Mitchell LaFrance. He was the old gentleman, and he lived up into his 90s, but he was born before the Civil War, and he grew up below New Orleans in Delacroix, and then he ended up later on lived in New Orleans, and after the Civil War, it was just where a lot of people migrated up to New Orleans. The storms forced them up to New Orleans too, from down below south of New Orleans, as the coastal regions eroded,
Right.
and there weren't, it was just totally unsafe to be there. But they ended up there, and he had a couple of guys that worked with him, a guy named George Frederick and a younger man named Charles Joffro. And so they ended up, Mitchell LaFrance started this cottage industry, and he ended up sold decoys to Lanassa Hardware. And so these decoys right here are typical Mitchell LaFrance decoys.
Is that a Mitchell LaFrance?
Well, it's termed Mitchell LaFrance in the fact that it's basically he was the person that headed up the group of carvers.
Okay.
In actuality, he was kind of the businessman. What Mitchell would do, can we talk about construction a little
Well,
bit?
I would love to. I see that signed by George Frederick.
It's signed by George Frederick, and actually it's Joffro, but people misspelled his name, so he ended up as a joke, started signing his name Gene Fro. So anyway, this is a bird that was carved around 1948,
It's
somewhere
in
in
such
there.
great shape.
And it was never hunted, but it was
Okay.
made as a lure to hunt ducks.
So it's supposed to be a working,
It would have been a working decoy, and they made literally hundreds of these, more than likely thousands of these over the years after World War II.
and each one is hand done.
It was hand done. What they did, materials of construction. Let's start with the wood. They're all made out of wood and native Louisiana woods. They preferred the root of the cypress tree,
Ah,
and not the knee, which is sometimes you start talking about cypress roots, you think of the knees.
right.
But the root of the cypress tree would be at the base. So what they would do during low water periods, they would go in and they would harvest a certain amount of the root. Careful not to kill the tree.
I was going to ask, but I was afraid to, but good. So the tree survived.
The trees did survive
Okay, good.
because that was their source of
Yeah.
wood. You kill the tree and the
That's
roots
right, you're
aren't
not
that good.
gonna, yeah.
But later on, when they were clearing canals for the oil industry and things like that, they would do that. They would get the roots from that. They would also pick up driftwood off the Mississippi River when the trees would wash out and wash during flood times. They would pick up and harvest the root off the tree stumps that would wash up.
So part of
Flotsam
the
and jetsam,
Yeah.
from that.
but a big part of their business was finding the wood, it sounds like, huh? That
That was a
that
big
couldn't have
part
been
of
easy.
it, getting good wood.
Yeah.
And the neat thing about these decoys is that they didn't have to be perfect, because these guys were plasterers. And so they would fill in the wood if there was a flaw in it with plaster and then paint over it so you wouldn't even know it.
You
But
never
today
know.
you see little telltales of the age, and so you might find a little place where the plaster was lifting, just like you might on your ceiling if it was a little bit old. So.
Interesting.
But they used cypress root, and others used tupelo wood from the tupelo gum tree. And the only wood that they liked was the last or the first 3 feet in the bell, what we call the bell of the tree, the wide base.
Yeah, because it was more in the water?
Well, what it was is that wood is such that it doesn't have a lot of grain. It's more like, almost like grainless wood. And so what it did, after it dried, it would not crack. And also, it would carve very well because of the lack of grain. Because if you get a hardwood with a lot of grain, if you take like a pine board
Yeah.
and you start trying
Yeah.
to cut it, the grain is much more dense than the rest of the
Yeah.
pulpy part in between. Well, the tupelo gum is just like all pulp. And it's very sturdy wood, and it also is lightweight. That's another thing they made the decoys to be, is very lightweight. And that way, whenever you take them out in a big sack to go hunting, you didn't have as much weight to carry. And so
True.
cypress root is very light. Tupelo gum is light as well. And so they would do that. What they would do when they cut the tree, a lot of them wouldn't even completely cut a root. They would cut part of a root, and then they would take wedges and bust out the root, and then leave that tree alone for a year.
Okay.
And not go back to it again until, and cut out enough for maybe 3 or 4 decoys out of a single piece of wood in the root, and get one big enough to make a body out of.
Okay.
And so that's the way they would do it. Or if they cut down tupelo trees, they would only use the first part, and the other part would be used for, other
Whatever else they needed to
whatever
use it
else
for,
they
yeah.
need. They didn't waste anything. If you look at some of these decoys, it's kind of interesting. This decoy right here, they actually
Now,
have a
this,
flaw in the
how old
wood.
is this one? I'd just like to know as we're going through. This
This
is an old one.
decoy is by a gentleman. I can give you his, he died in 1953. He was born in 1880. It's
Wow.
a gentleman named John Gallardo Sr. And this is an early decoy that was probably around the turn of the century, just for,
Yeah, just so we can kind of place it kind of on the timeline, so to speak.
probably no later than the 1920s, but around the turn of the century. It's an old bird. But if you look here at this bird, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see it had a flaw in the wood, and they just basically replaced a
We're going
piece
to
of
give
the wood.
him a second to zoom in. There we go. Oh, yeah, you can see that.
And so,
So that happened when that's a flaw in the wood. That isn't a damage after the bird was
no, he just
made and
used
put it-
that to make the bird. He didn't waste the wood. And you can see some of the checks in the wood. Those were probably already cracking, and then he ended up used that to make the body of the bird. They just didn't waste anything. And, we need to maybe take some lessons
from
that.
them.
Yeah.
Now, how about painting those? Because that paint's been on there a long time, and has that been in water? Was that a working
It's a working bird. If you look at the bottom of the decoy, you'll see that it had a ballast weight, which is
Okay.
designed to keep the
Sitting upright?
set upright. And depending on the weight of the wood and how it's set, they would put the weight on last to make it float properly in the water. Because if it lists to one side, they might offset the weight a little bit.
Okay.
So they would use that depending on the density of the wood. Louisiana ended up employed a lot of unique things. Very few carvers ended up made a single piece decoy. They would make the body, and they would usually take that and they would chop it on a block with a chopping axe to get the body into the basic shape. And then they would end up use their knife and carve these raised wings to show the outline of the wing, to show the detail. And then the head would be carved separately.
I was going to ask if it was two pieces, because I see some look like they're glued on.
They are glued or they're nailed. And some people in Louisiana would use cypress pegs to glue the head on, or to attach the head to keep from having to use nails due to the salt water and the
True.
corrosion.
Okay.
So nails wouldn't hold up as well. Now, if they were typically hunting in freshwater, they would use nails sometimes. So it depended on whether they were marsh hunting or freshwater hunting. So.
Lots of details, lots of things to know. Huh?
Oh, yeah, the Creoles in themselves were very unique in that they employed a technique that was called scratch painting. If you zoom in, let's get a different decoy here to show. This might be easier to see right here. If you look at the bird, you'll see that the base coat was primered. Then they came in with the lighter brown, and they would paint that wet. And the unique scratch painting technique is that they would take a sharp object like an awl or a nail or something after the brown was on there, and they would go in and individually scratch each one of the little places around to show the feathering. And then they would come back with the black to paint inside those grooves to where they had scratched to show the feathering.
Oh, I
So
can see that, yeah.
it's an individual technique referred to as scratch painting. And the only other place they did very much of that was up in the Illinois region, Illinois River region. So we're not sure. There's a mystery about where that came from. Did someone from Illinois bring decoys to Louisiana in the 1800s to show somebody or share and hunt with, or Did somebody come down and hunt here and take it up there? That's still
We
yet to
don't
be
know.
determined.
We don't know.
So anyway, we'd like to think that Louisiana started it.
Well, I'm going to just go ahead and say that's probably so. So this is, but it's the Creole carvers that did this technique, not just all of our carvers.
A few of the others adopted that, but there would have been their influence and the
Okay.
south of New Orleans influence and mouth of the river and any of those decoys down there, whether they were Creole, and the Creoles are a very tight group.
Mm-hmm.
They were the free people of color that, were, like you say, very talented artisans, had their own culture. They had, they lived together. They were very close as a community. And so a lot of people patterned their carvings off of the Creole pattern because they were so versatile and beautiful,
And they are beautiful.
and they ended up did that. So,
So while we have this bird highlighted, tell me a little bit about this one.
okay. Well, this is a mallard hen. Of course, the species is important to the birds as well. You wanted to carve birds that you
That you were
have-
hunting.
that you hunt. And it's kind of interesting, we talk about rarity. Mallards are pretty common birds, and so you have a lot of mallards in, that are carved.
Right.
Pintails are not quite as, common, but they are still common in Louisiana. This is a pintail hen, and pintails are not quite as common. They would typically carve a lot of pintail drakes, but not as many pintail hens. So
Because there weren't as many pintail hens being hunted, or
and the
why?
other deal is that they were a little harder to paint because hens are a little more detailed.
You
than
have
the
a hen
drakes.
over here,
That's right.
so we'll talk about her.
Okay.
She's a beauty, by the way.
Oh, yeah, and she is very, very old, and she's also a LaFrance decoy from that group of carvers, and particularly one of the things that...
She doesn't look old, excuse me, Gary, but she looks really good.
Well, this bird was hunted some, and it's beautiful what happens to the birds. Wonderful patina that develops on them after all these years, and this is the kind of bird I like. It's got just enough paint left to show what it was, at the beginning, and but it shows the wear of time. What's really beautiful about this bird is a lot of these birds, they would end up actually curve the body some
Yeah.
to show the bird swimming, kind of like they would curve around and swim. And so little techniques like that are very, very special on these birds. Later on, Mitchell LaFrance got onto those guys, George Frederick and Charles Jofro, because they were taking too much time to carve those decoys. And so he started telling them, don't spend all that time to detail the bills, and so that's when they started in the 40s. They went to what we call these bubblehead decoys, where the bills aren't quite as distinct, and the heads are more bubbled versus the unique, details.
And it really, has a graceful head.
It's very, very beautiful, and it's a rare species. It's a green-winged teal, which teal are less, you didn't get as much meat, so they weren't
Yeah, they're
a typical market hunting bird. In the early days, there were a lot of canvasbacks, but teal were good to eat, and so the Creoles liked them, and so they hunted over them, and their teal are some of the best eating.
Well, she's a beauty. Do you want to set her down?
Yeah, uniquely, a bird like this is not a real appealing bird. It's a doggery or bluebill, and it's a very rare, even though it's a black and white decoy, it's a very rare decoy in that not many people ate them or hunted them. They would let them pass by.
Because they weren't very good?
They didn't taste as good as a teal or even the more common ringneck that looked similar to them. And so this would become a very rare species for those carvers, and so it makes it collectible. So that's kind of, when you look at collectability, you look at maker, you look at age, you look at species, and you look at form, and so the most beautiful form from the earliest period by the best makers are the most sought after and valuable birds in the collecting world.
Right. And how does that one rate?
This is pretty rare.
Okay.
This is pretty rare. And you notice the beauty of the shape of the head.
Yeah.
Same maker as these birds here, but you see more detail to the head versus the roundness. It's got a little more groove in the eye.
So this one was made before they had to start turning out more ducks?
Oh, yeah. It was made before the 40s. This is probably in the 30s. And these things like this are kind of interesting. You see a little paint loss.
Uh-huh.
And some people have a tendency to want to do things about that
Like
and have them
fix it.
restored. And it's okay to restore decoys. But some of us are more purist. And it's like, is it, if the bill was broken off, you would put a new bill on it or fix the bill. But something like that where you have a minor amount of paint loss, it's not a major thing.
That just
So
adds to the richness, I think, in some ways.
it just adds to the history. And
Yeah.
you want to ask yourself, I wonder what happened that day.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
One individual was talking about that carved decoys, and I'll lay that there, in the 70s, his dad carved, and he said, what was really great about hunting over wooden duck decoys is that the ducks, people would tell you how well they looked on the water. He said, but when ducks would fly in and land and come up to the decoy and peck on it, trying to get it to respond, that's the most important compliment a carver could ever have.
If you can fool a duck, you did it right.
That's right.
Because, and basically what that tells us is these are proportioned by size.
Oh, yeah.
They're the right size, the right color, the right everything, to fool a duck.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And that's what they were for. They were a working tool.
So these really were not decorative items. I guess to a large extent they are now, but these early ones really were not.
And it's amazing how much detail they put into something. You could probably lure ducks if they were hungry enough or something in fact, some people do it. They'll paint a 2-liter Coke bottle black and put it in the water and float it, and sometimes ducks would come
Not
to
so
that.
much charm to that.
So it's unique that they went to so much detail, that they were so meticulous to the species of the duck, just like a pintail hen. It'll have this orange bar on the speculum with green, with black above, and it's very unique that way compared to the mallard, who has blue with 2 white stripes. And then they have a summer mallard that's in a lot of places they call a mottled duck that doesn't have the stripes, and so they would have blue without stripes.
So I guess you need a decoy for all the ducks you were going to be hunting. I mean, you would have to have an assortment of decoys if you were going to hunt different ducks. Am I right?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Sometimes ducks, especially later in the season, they get very, very skittish.
Okay.
And so you want to have your best lures out at that time. But what's really interesting is that a lot of carvers would make a poodoo or coot. It's a great confidence decoy. It's not going to come somewhere where there's danger. And so they would, a lot of times, carvers would have a stool of just poodoo, and they would end up, they would hunt over those, and mallards and pintails and everything would come into them, teal, because they know that's a confidence bird.
Okay, so
It's a confidence decoy.
That's your universal bird.
And it's so easy to paint.
I hate to stop, we're getting close to out of time, and I want to spend our last minute or two talking about the show itself.
Okay.
Because, this is so fascinating and so much fun, and there's more we can learn if we just go to the Decoy show, is that right?
That's right.
So tell me a bit more about that.
Okay, it's going to be August 17th. We've been very fortunate to partner up with the Baton Rouge Recreation and Parks Commission, specifically the Bluebonnet Swamp Nature Center on off of Bluebonnet Boulevard. And last year we had the first show about same time last year, and it just went over with a tremendous success. We had exhibitors from all the Gulf states. We had Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, a lot from Louisiana, several from Texas. This year is going to be just as fabulous, even more so. I've got 6 exhibitors from Texas, 3 from Florida, 2 or 3 from Alabama, and a host from over 37 exhibitors.
Wow.
In addition to that, this year we're kind of adding more to it.
We are running out, so
Okay, there's going to be kids' activities. There's going to be a lot of activities.
$3 admission, is that right?
$3 admission to the center, and it also makes you eligible for door prizes that every exhibitor will be giving towards
Sounds
the show.
great. Gary, I hate to cut you off. I said earlier we have 2 shows here, but thank you so much for coming. This was wonderful.
Thank
Just
you for
wanna
having
thank
me,
you.
Linda.
And thank you for watching The Extra Mile.
It's going to be August 17th. We've been very fortunate to partner up with the Baton Rouge Recreation and Parks Commission, specifically the Bluebonnet Swamp Nature Center on off of Bluebonnet Boulevard. And last year we had the first show about same time last year, and it just went over with a tremendous success. We had exhibitors from all the Gulf states. We had Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, a lot from Louisiana, several from Texas. This year is going to be just as fabulous, even more so.